Hi, and welcome to our history podcast. Today, we're going to be covering the Silk Road to modern supply chains. And what I mean by that is we're going to put a few things together, as you'll see as we go through the presentation today, and also just to get an understanding of how trade we think is new, we think customs is new, we think modern day moving of goods is new, but it's not. It's evolved over many years. So we're going to have a bit of history, and I'm going to try and compare them together. Um, the Silk Road is very interesting to a lot of people. Anybody managed to read the books? Obviously, we know with Frankenpen recently wrote quite a good book on the Silk Road. So anybody, historians out there who enjoy reading, my takes on a bit of that, but also as a modern twist to it, just to kind of highlight in international trade how things just evolve, and that's as we see the most important parts. Um, the Silk Road was 130 BC to about 1450 AD, and we're going to go through the different histories of that, of how the Silk Road started, what it was about, what is the Silk Road, and really what the kind of benefits in them days and how we see the benefits today, and the challenges within supply chain that we see every day today. Nothing new today, probably more challenging than ever. We hear a lot about geopolitics. Geopolitics have been around for many years. It's just different wordings used in different ways. So sit back, enjoy. I hope I deliver it to for your liking and you'll enjoy it, and hope that I can explain each area. When we talk about the series and why we wanted to talk about different historian sections, particularly the Silk Road today. We're going to be doing the Roman Empire and other topics. But we talk about trade and tariffs, supply chain disruption, origin fraud. Can you believe that origin fraud is one of the most misused systems around the world for, well, we call it thousands of years? It's nothing new, and I'll go through that. It's quite interesting to see. Port control and customs. What's all that about? Port control. What do I mean? Surely not 2,000 years ago. Well, let's see what the history tells us and how it kind of matches and different areas of that match. And it's really interesting. Modern parallels, if you think about it, we've got things like sanctions. When we think about customs audits, anti-dumping, well, there's a lot within the first parts of the silk trade. But what was the Silk Trade or the Silk Road, as we would say? The Silk Road was started, and the idea of the Silk Road was to be able to, not be as we talk about today, not be just so reliant on your trade that you have, to actually go out to the global world and see. And this is how the Silk Road began to be built, in Asia, Persia, and all around there. We'll see how, in mass deserts, mass land, of how goods were physically moved in them days, but how they move today. Obviously, not as not as extreme, because obviously we have a lot more technology, but the technology has just evolved over the years. It's just interesting. Again, every Sunday, as we said, we're going to be covering the Silk Road, Roman network, origin fraud, sea trade, and modern supply chains. So we've got quite a few things to talk about, which I think will be nice. And again, countries today, they still compete for ports, logistics, and all these key areas. So again, we're going to be covering a lot of these areas today. So let's start with the story and let's see the interest there and see, sit back, enjoy. Again, comment if you want to comment on it. Some people have different views and different areas. My take is very much on history, how it was evolved, and really putting a link in there with modern trade. We talk about trade in many ways, in commodity codes, origins, free trade agreements, etc. But actually, is that new? Is that something? Is that a new phenomenon? Is that something new in this century or last century? Let's see. Let's sit back and enjoy. It was a network spanning 4,000 miles. So if you think Central Asia, China, and if you think China, I mean, this is something I always think about. When I look at trade and we talk about traders today, we think now, obviously, we hear a lot of geopolitics, but we see China, this powerhouse, don't we? The powerhouse of global trade. It's still one of the mass producers. Lots of countries are importing from China, and they produce, and their exports, are kind of growing and growing and growing over many, many years, and to a stage where people now are not happy with that because they feel like they're too powerful. But it's what you create. But actually, when you look back 4,000 years ago, this is where it first started. So it's always interesting how it kind of repeats itself. Obviously, there are more challenges there. it relied on trade systems and again moving. And how did you move? So how would you move goods on, we'll talk about this. How did the goods move? It's really interesting when we start to see how everything evolves. And it's really my take because I could read a book and I could just read this out to you, but this is my, many readings of different books and everything else on Silk Road. It's something that has always interested me, and I'm just trying to keep everything in my head. So if I make a couple of mistakes, please accept my apologies. It's not easy when you haven't got any, I've got no writing or anything in front of me, so this is all stuck in my head. But we call it the camel caravan. And why do we call it that? Well, if you imagine most things, because camels, in the very early days, could literally go for miles and miles and miles without, resting or anything else. So it's a great way to actually physically move goods. When you think of deserts, extreme heat, the different weather temperatures, a camel was accustomed to all that. It's actually quite interesting when I was in Qatar in 2019 doing a presentation. I always remember pulling up in a taxi just outside the city, and we stopped for somebody on his camel to come past us, and it just intrigued me to think, wow, still in this day, people are still using camels in the Middle East and other places. Not obviously all the time, but it's just interesting. And we called it the caravan because people just went, loaded the goods, whatever they were selling. If you think about the Silk Road, there's a thing in that, and I'll explain why it become popular. When you think of spices and all that, how did you physically move that? You know, it was dangerous. Obviously, it had mountains, it had deserts, unstable political territories. You imagine you're going through different territories. It's no different than what it is today, if you think about it. Instead, it's a bit more, well, is it? Is it any different? Is history repeating itself where things start to happen where, people become more powerful and they want protection and all these kind of areas. So it's interesting, isn't it? But global supply chains have been always been exposed to risk. So this is my take on it, even though the camel and the caravan, as we call it, the camel caravan, it was original logistics network. That's how things were moved. Interesting. Um, the caravan Syria, it was a hub. So just think about it, where people stopped, rested, held goods, and then somebody else took the goods. Well, think about it now when you think of the pallet network. You pick goods up, you move it into a warehouse, you then somebody else comes and collects it and moves it. And that was kind of how the supply chain started, or we resupply trade. So, they wouldn't go from one place all the way 4,000, 5,000 miles. They maybe, stop, rest, logistics hub as we know it today. They will stop, rest, feed, have things, and then somebody else will take over that journey. Really interesting when you start to put the two things together. Um, you know, Camels were one of the first things in the desert logistics because they could travel long distances, like I've always said. So always think about that because people say, well, how would you use? But they could also carry heavy cargo. Now, not heavy cargo as we see today, but heavy enough cargo where, vast amounts of camel could walk, thousands of, well, not thousands of miles, but hundreds of miles without resting and then a rest. And then they would use the hubs and then somebody else would take over. Long haul freight systems, if you think about it, it's only the same principle when we think of anything when we talk about logistics. Again, where East met West, silk, spices, gold, ideas, people started to want different things. So things started to evolve, but you have to be able to move the goods to get them there. How do you move goods from places that are literally just deserts and other places? So the sort of connected cultures, economies, civilizations, trade moved not only goods but religion, if you think about it, science, language. Think about language. So you're thinking now when we talk about things like services, when we look at the UK in particular, our service industry is very big. But actually, languages and services was many, many years ago because by moving, talking different languages, you were learning different languages and different cultures. You know, it was a culture exchange. It was even when we think about it, it had a global awareness. Is that any different to what we see in the modern trade today? Trade is always connected with products, always our services. That's key. But I'm going to talk about Rome, but Rome had an obsession with silk because silk, was deemed to be of a high quality. Having silk, really, you can imagine obviously in Rome, you can imagine it was a status to have silk. So having silk, then to import the silk from different areas as we do now. Is, if you look at as an importer, most countries in Europe and UK and the US and other countries, a high demand. We bring quality products in, don't we? We import either raw material or we import products that we can't physically make ourselves. Clothing, if you think about clothing, obsession with clothing in the UK, it's not made in the UK, is it? It's all out to Bangladesh and Vietnam and all these other countries, China, Malaysia, all different countries. So it's really interesting when we start to see. But Rome really were the first people in around about 27 BC to 476 AD, if I remember that rightly. Again, any historian will probably quote me on that. But it was a modern consumer demand. So if there's a demand there, we're going to service it. How do you service it? It's all about demand shared supply chain. So the supply chain started to really grow, and we started to see, checkpoints, taxation. Every empire took its cut. So, I'm always intrigued with this, and it's something I talk about when we do our level 4 diploma. We do one on history, and we talk a lot about this. Is that we assume that checkpoints, customs points, taxations is something completely new. It's been around for centuries. It's been there forever. It's a way of recuperating money for somebody entering. Whether Romans did it with products or slaves or whatever, you paid a fee to come in. And there were checkpoints all around. Nothing's changed. That's still today. And we're seeing that probably more aggressively than we've ever done. You know, the empires, they established checkpoints, so you couldn't come in, whichever route you came in, you would have to pay a fee. And obviously, people tried to do it in different ways. And we're going to talk about origins and other areas, what we're going to touch on, because it's quite interesting actually when you start to see that. But modern customs duties and VAT, think of it like that. So when you're thinking or looking at this, have a think about it, because governments still use trade taxation. It's been there forever. It's a way of getting money, income. And what you do with that, obviously, in them days, they might have done things slightly different, but it's nothing different to the modern trade of the supply chain. The world's first global trade system. So, as we saw the camels, it started, the route connected civilizations, it started to move. And we're going back, if you look at these dates, it's incredible, isn't it? 200 BC, 1450 AD. Global systems have not changed, it's just evolved. Nothing changes. And it's incredible that somebody had this mind to think like this. We all think when we're sitting in trade and we're coming up with all these ideas. If you think about it, somebody already had them ideas. Obviously, and they didn't have the luxury we have today with modern trade. And that will change. I mean, the challenge we have was what they had. The biggest challenge we have in our trade now is AI, technology, AI. It will either take us to a new level or it will stop us in our tracks and something else will happen. AI, you'll be able to ask questions on there. Does that affect people like myself and who are trade experts? Possibly, but you have to accept it and you have to move with the times. There's nothing we can do about that. I truly believe you always need that hand to help you, but again, you just don't know, do you? And it's up to everybody to decide how they use AI and technology. But I see that as our biggest challenge here in the modern world of supply chain, where they saw different areas, and I'm going to explain how you go from a camel, at what other level do you go to. So again, it's interesting. The Silk Road connected multiple empires into one commercial ecosystem. Goods move from China into Europe, and I'm going to go a little bit more detail into that through interconnected relay trading systems. So it's exactly the same, isn't it? Ports, going air freight, going through, different airports, road freight, going through different hubs. Nothing changes, does it? But this was the foundation of a commercial integration that people started to see the benefits. And to this day, we still see benefits. Lots of companies rely heavily on their exports, like the China, they rely heavily on their export market because that is good for the economy. It creates jobs, creates security, and creates lots of other things. So it's very interesting. How did it work? So if you think about the flow chart, Goodsman, and think of this for your origin. You ever been asked the question, how do you create your origin? It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's, if you think about this, so goods made in China, silk, spices, porcelain, passed between merchants. So it went between a merchant or broker, as we know it today. No signature made the full journey. So they used different hubs. Taxed at every checkpoint. So as they went through each hub or each checkpoint, they were charged then a fee for that, which we would call as duty today, or arriving in a country Obviously, we didn't have things like T documents and things where you could move through different. If you was in the EU, you went to one country, you moved to another. Now there are different ways you can do that. Arrived in Rome or Persia, months or years later, you can imagine the amount of time this took. And then it's sold. They sold then with a massive markup. Is that any different to what we do today? I don't think it is. So when you actually look at it, it's quite interesting. It already resemble modern supply chain. This is modern supply chain. If somebody asks you about your origin and how it's where it's made from, and I know that your origin has to be processed, manufactured, and they changed a lot of that in the modern world. Where years and years ago there were a lot more challenges there, but it's been abused for many years. With anything, there's challenges, and we've seen the bandit raiders, the desert and mountain terrain. You can imagine walking. I mean, these people must have been as absolutely super fit. I get excited with myself when I do my 16,000 steps a day. I think I've achieved the, absolute, to the highest level goal mark. But you think these were walking for miles and miles and miles. They must have been as fit as everything. They didn't have chocolate and all that, did they? They just lived on whatever they lived on. It's incredible, isn't it? But part of that, then you get. And this is where we've really evolved. Probably not as much as we like to think we have, but you like to think disease and famine, caused, major problems. You imagine walking and you're halfway in a desert, and then you need food or you need supplies, and you might be another 500 miles away or 100 miles away, and you're walking. Me for 2 miles, it takes what 30 odd minutes just to do 2 miles. Imagine doing 10 miles, and you're hungry and you need feeding. It caused a lot of political instability because obviously there were challenges there on the way. Again, ancient supply chains already resemble modern, as we've always talked about. But again, the dangers of the Silk Road always had kind of challenges within it. Risk management always essential to trade. So again, somebody would have to then have a look at this. They wouldn't just set off with goods and silk and everything else. They'd be thinking, how do I protect that? How do I protect that? Because somebody might want that. So again, bandits and all the other things pirates say, sanctions wars, am I allowed to take these goods that I've made? Is Rome going to accept it, or is somebody going to stop it on its way? All these challenges that we see today, and we talk about risk management, don't we? So it's quite interesting when we start to look at the how it all kind of evolves together. The Mongols and the Pax Mongolica, you know, Genghis Khan, and the later Kublai Khan. The Mongol Empire created the largest connected trade zone. It's really interesting if you ever get a chance to read anything on Genghis. I remember watching things when I was a kid on Genghis Khan. Never really understood history when I was a kid. It was, we had the most boring teacher, and it kind of just passed over my head. Now, when I look back, I think as you get older, you start to be intrigued more with trade. Genghis Khan unifies the routes. So what that did, he created a global market for everybody. That things could move very quickly, safely. And again, Khan expands into east-west trade, safe passage, the YAM system, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And it's interesting when we talk about the YAM system, and again, how that evolves today's market. And this was your first true globalization. So trade routes grow, as we know, when it becomes secure. So you look at China now, goods coming from China using the Land of Good Hope. Wouldn't you like to do the normal passage? But at the moment, it causes much more challenges. And that means that you have to be very much supply chain management. You need to understand that it's going to take longer, and it's going to take a bit of a challenge there. Genghis Khan, as I mentioned, one man, one empire, one trade zone. So he was there to protect. He made sure that things worked and things were protected. And he tried to create the largest empire in history, well known as we know for his conquest. His empire also stabilized trade routes and encouraged movements. Again, I just jotted some notes just in my head, some bullet points. Control the logistics, I would say. It's the control of the logistics. And if you can move freely between zones, you're going to move more and more goods out of you, because now there's suddenly an opening where you can actually take that chance. And similar to if you think of China, it started to become a powerhouse. It made sure all the trade routes were there, and it's now been very successful with that. It's created a powerhouse, and that's what happens when somebody has a vision. It's very important. The Mongol cavalry again speed was their supply chain. So you imagine now you've got horses going at speed, and you're interconnecting, and that's similar to how we move goods either by road freight, by not so much ocean because obviously it's going port to port, but air freight, it's going different airports, and it's speed and it courier using a smaller van that you can move things very quickly, but also having hubs that you can go to so you can get your rest because obviously, as you can imagine, in the UK, you've got your driving hours and everything else. So if you by vehicle or by Arctic lorries, you're very much restricted there. So again, you have the hubs that you can keep moving. So some of that by yourself might take you a long time. Using multiple channels through that could reduce that time, and that's what it was all about. It was a massive supply chain advantage to that. And again, controlling that logistics was very important actually. It was the thing that shaped commercial success. It was how it worked, and it was an interesting time. As we know, the Pax Mongolica, that was a safe passage, so that allowed goods to move and to move freely. It was very important that people felt comfortable, and it gave that political stability that you were safe, you could move goods, and you knew that if you was going from one place to another, that you were in safe hands, and that's where you see different routes of things. Or a lot of people use air freight because they feel it's much more secure if they're moving, from here to Australia or here to the US or here to China or somewhere else, and they don't want to spend lots of time on the water, and it's only a couple of pallets. They might invest in doing it on air freight because it's more secure. It's a much quicker passage, and it arrives a lot quicker. That gives you a trading advantage. So again, this was interesting. The YAM system, again, it was that speed. It was the courier. It was what we know as the courier today. It was the YAM system was like a relay courier network, passing on from one to another to speed up that time. So somebody took one leg, somebody took the other leg, so put all at speed, and we called that the YAM system. We call it the first express logistics network. That's what we call it today. Very interesting. Communication speed, all about communication. How do we communicate today? We were much more advanced, but there they had to communicate. It's very important because you have to know where that person is or where they are to then be able to relay. So again, it worked very well in the time that it was. We had Marco Polo then traveling east in 1271, and that changed the west view of the world. So he was, Marco traveled from Venice to the court of Kilcran. His writing exposed Europe to the wealth and sophistication of Asian influenced a lot of future exploration. And what I mean by that is that it gives people to understand. So he was probably one of the first people to travel east. And like I said, trade intelligence and market information still shape international strategies to today. So he was one of the first people to do that. It's very interesting. Obviously, it's a quick Sunday morning, relax and listen. But again, it's all about information in it. Information, it's there. And what we say on that is information drives that ambition. Unfortunately, though, with that, there's some of those darkest chapters of the Black Death. We have to mention this because it's important. It originated in Central Asia. It carried by merchants and rats, as you can imagine, spread along trade routes, reached Europe by Crimea in 1346, killed 1 in 3 Europeans. That's really is the darkest hour in it, if you think about it. Now, the only thing I can kind of refer to that, if anything, is COVID-19. COVID-19 demonstrates how in connected man and split remain vulnerable. The COVID-19, um, yeah, COVID-19 we called it, didn't we? It had a huge effect in it. And I still don't think we recovered from that. I still think we made fundamental mistakes within it. But hey, it's not for me to discuss that. I'm here just to talk about trade. But this was one of the darkest hours of Europe. And it was, when you look at it, the trade routes became vectors of death. So obviously, as it moved, it passed on, and that was one of the big challenges within when the West, and we know, and I'll put a perspective on this. If you think of like the modern supply chain, if you just look at what's happened just recently with Iran, with the Strait of Hormuz and other challenges we've had at different other pain points, as we would call it. Obviously, China with the Pirate Sea and everything else. We've had problems with the Suez Canal, and we've had issues over the years with the Panama. So, we are very much reliant, aren't we? Because about 90%, I did some figures on this. I was quite shocked. I thought it was less than this. But some data was telling us about 90% of ocean freight around the world that moves. That's a huge amount of traffic. Well, this has a huge effect. Obviously, it doesn't cause death, but you can see how we are so reliant and how things can easily turn. So yeah, it was a tough old time for them. The ships arrived in Crimea, the world would never be the same. Obviously, it had a huge effect. Again, they play reach Europe through port cities like the Mediterranean, as you can imagine. Um, and it became the gateways for both commerce and disease, unfortunately, and that's what happens. Modern ports remain critical infrastructure, but they're also vulnerable if diseases. You've only just seen that recently on some of the cruise ships where there's been some outbreak or something, and it has a huge effect on it. Who controls the ports? Often, as we know, control trade. So that's why ports play a really important role, and especially in the modern trade we're in now. If you look at, the amount of cargo ships coming into shipping vessels and everything coming into just the UK and other ports, it's a phenomenal amount. So you can see how trade really does move. Markets closed, trades collapsed, supply chain broke. So again, it's that planning. What would happen in today's modern trade if things started to really get challenging? Supply chains depend on confidence, don't they? And it's no different to today. And that was one of the, port city panic as we known it in them days. And it's the challenge what we see today when we're seeing all the challenges ahead of us in modern supply chain. And sometimes it's very difficult to understand what we should be doing and how we should be planning our strategy because it's hard, isn't it? Because it's changing constantly. And then we have the US with Section 232 and other challenges within protection within the US. We've got the EU now bringing in CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It makes it harder, doesn't it, to trade, and it creates that little bit of panic and uncertainty, which is obviously we don't want. The greatest supply chain disruption in history. One in three Europeans said it's, a horrible thing when you think about it. But major disruption, it changes the economic systems. And we're seeing a little bit of a shift at the moment. There's a lot of challenges to China. There's India now growing. India now is starting to be a major powerhouse. There's lots of other countries, Europe in general, together are trying to control Europe with CBAM and other things around there. So again, there's a lot of challenges. UK, small little island, still a big play, but more challenges within the UK. The decline of the Silk Road, the Ottoman control. So the Ottoman Empire blocks routes, European power seeks sea routes. So we start to see that change. European powers search for direct sea routes to Asia. And today, as I've put on there, nothing really changes, is it? You have to find different routes. I've just put some dates here. European power seeks Vasco da Gama's rounds, Africa 1498. Ocean trade replaces overland. Silk Road fades. Still here today, but it's just in a different way. But you can see supply chains are constantly looking at better options, and that's no different to today. Origin fraud 2000 U made in A, rerouted by B, relabeled, declared as B, lower tariff. It's nothing new, is it? How many times when you're sending goods, you need a certificate of origin or you claim the origin, but you're not quite sure, is it the origin? You're not 100% sure. It's no different. But there are ways that people abuse it. It's been abused for, like I said, 2000 years. And we're going to do a little history on origin fraud. It's quite surprising, actually, when you look at what people did to avoid. And things like this was avoided. They'll do different routes. They'll go through a different route, then claim that it was coming directly from there, just to make it less taxation. So origin, fraud, as we say it, has been around for centuries, and it's the hardest challenge. So when you hear about the WCO, the WTO, country challenges, there's still a huge amount of goods that enter the countries that are not really using the correct origin. I think that's today as well. I don't think that's any different. And I don't think many companies are doing anything particularly wrong. It's not just understanding their exposure. But what happened in the last year is we've become now much more, our visibility has become a lot more greater because of things that have happened recently in the US and other challenges that now we're starting to look at things and probably as governments. But one thing I would say, AI is playing a big, it's a big challenge in there. So trade creative power, control routes, control the price, tax every merchant, deny access to rivals. What is that any different? How many sanctions do you see on places like Russia and other places and other countries where we're not happy with it, where there's anti-dumping, where we have a protection? There's nothing different, is there? If you think about it, modern equivalents include transshipments and all sorts of there. But when you power and you don't want goods coming in, only have to look at CBAM, you only have to look at other things. These are a protection. They're a blocking way of not allowing goods to enter into a country because there's some protection there. whether we agree with it or disagree with it, that's the reality, and that's what happens. Unfortunately, it's one of the trying to remain deeply connected, and that's what happens when you're generating and you huge incomes. It's a challenge, isn't it? Then that somebody else wants to come in, and no duties, no tariffs or anything, and then the government's not really making any money out of it. There are certain things that, or countries, should I say, not just obviously I'm speaking from the UK, but things like the EU, how to protect. So there's lots of things you can that countries do, and it's not changed. The first rules, as we were saying, origin. Um, if you have an audit tomorrow, would you be confident with the origin? In them days, they would use it in different ways. Declarations, documents, because obviously you had to have documents. They'll manipulate the documents. Obviously, there weren't things what could be checked as much. And it's still the same. We have audits, don't we, where we check documents and everything else. But if you had a document which was changed slightly, how would you question that in them days? So again, it's nothing new. It's been there forever. What's changed? So ancient Silk Road to the modern supply chain. Transshipment still the same. Tariff evasion, tariff engineering, as we call it today. Origin dispute, rules of origin fraud, route manipulation, FTA manipulation. It's nothing, if you think about it and you put the two together, there's not a huge amount of changes, is there? When you think it's just things evolve, don't they, over the years and change. And it's always, like I say, it's really interesting when you start to think about how somebody created this all them many years ago, and today it's still used, but just in different ways. It's an incredible way, isn't it? We say modern supply chains still follow ancient principles, so same routes, new technology. Digital tools have changed the map, not the logic. It's still the same. You're still moving from one port to another, but there's obviously more ports now, more infrastructure. Tariffs still shaped every decision. So there were tariffs, the Romans, with the tariffs, etc. That's not changed. And there's still loopholes that you can try and manipulate. So what's changed there? Who controls the ports? So again, access to remain the real power in global reach ports, because if the ports close, goods can't then enter. So again, ports play a huge, very important, and ports around the world have been very successful with this, for the amount of goods, etc., coming. So just give you like a bit of history. 3000 BC, camel caravans, sailing ship. Obviously, we had 200 BC Roman roads, sailing ships, steam and rail, air freight came in. Today's container shipping. So things have just evolved, haven't they? They've evolved over the years. When you think of that camel, who would ever thought, looking into the history, these huge ships with all these containers on? It's an incredible amount of movements in it on the sea, and you just wonder, don't you, if something happened at sea, how many goods would actually stop moving? It's an incredible thought, isn't it? The big lesson is what we wanted to talk about on the history of trade is it repeats itself. All patterns show up again in new routes and new markets. So opportunities come. Power follow the routes or control the corridors. So we see that today that some ports or some countries control what's coming in and out. But even China will be the biggest exporter, but they control the ports of goods coming in. I've always said that's one of my biggest challenges for China, that on one hand they want to export, but on the other hand they don't want to import because they want to stay very much as an exporter. But there's a balance in there, and I think that's always the challenge. Again, from that, know the rules or pay the price. Trade succeeds when understand the regulations that shape it. How many people talk about regulations and challenges around there? It's one of our biggest challenges, isn't it? Our next one, we're going to be how Rome built the world's first supply chain network. This is really interesting. There's a lot of work. I've been studying a lot in Rome, Vatican, and all around this. And I just came up with this theory when I was reading it. I thought, you know what, this is so interesting to see. And our next one is going to be around, Rome. And again, how modern infrastructure to today has followed a lot of the Roman thought process and what they did. And it's incredible when you start to look at it. With thanks for joining us. I know that was quite intense, and like I say, it's just a modern twist on it. So it's sometimes a challenge when you talk about history and then the modern side of it. Drop us a line if you've enjoyed it today. And like I said, we're going to be doing a lot more on the history because I think there's some really interesting, and it's just good in it to see both sides. It's good to see a bit of history and a bit of the modern day of how things don't really change. So a big thanks for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next Sunday. But remember, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, our podcast. One on Monday is about compliance. Wednesday is our trade newsletter. Keeps you up to date with all trade information. Friday is our sales strategy, and then every second Sunday, we're going to be doing a podcast on history. The reason it's every 2 weeks at the moment is because there's a lot of learning, a lot of trying to put the two together. It's not easy. It's not easy when you're trying to work out the two, putting it, calculating how it corresponds with history to modern day. There's a lot of work that goes into that, so you need that couple of weeks just to be prepared. But again, thanks for joining us. All we ask you, as we always do, please subscribe. That's all we ask, and you'll get these in your inbox, or you'll get notified when we're releasing our podcast. But thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you.